Okay, so welcome to Stage 1 and Stage 2 Ancient Studies. I'm just going to be talking now about the booklet for Stage 1 and introduce the courses. So that's this booklet here. I also have a Google Classroom. I've put these booklets on Daymap and on the Google Classroom. I'll give you the Google Classroom login a bit later too. The only difference between the stuff on Daymap and the stuff on the Google Classroom is that I'm going to be recording the lectures, and the lectures will be on the Google Classroom. They won't be on Daymap because Daymap's pathetic and has a upload limit that won't work. So whereas Google Classroom doesn't, so I'll be putting the videos on Google Classroom. But for now, we're looking at Stage 1 Ancient Studies. So on the first page, you've got all the stuff about the learning requirements and the content. So I'll let you have a read through that later, but basically it's a 10 credit subject that we're studying for Term 1 and Term 2. So down the bottom of this page there, the topics that will be covered in Ancient Studies in 2021. Yeah, I kind of thought I got all those because that's copy and paste for you, but I clearly didn't. First one is Daily Life in Imperial Rome. So we'll be looking at the life status group, citizenship, family life, women, children, slaves, free people, freed people, and various other social distinctions. Then we'll get on to entertainment, such as gladiators and chariot racing and all that kind of stuff. So that's what we'll be looking at in Term 1. And then in Term 2, military conflict, the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BC. So that was the war that took place between the city-states of Athens and Sparta in ancient Greece. And so we'll be talking about that in Term 2. So that'll be the main focus of our study. So we just have basically a main focus of study, which will usually have 2 assignments per term. In Term 1, there'll be 2 kind of essay-ish assignments. In Term 2, there will be an essay plus what we call a timed essay. I'm not allowed to call it an exam because it's not an exam, but basically it's under exam conditions. You're writing an essay here in class, so obviously you don't have to footnote or reference it or anything like that. But we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Okay, so the next page has details of teaching arrangements, and then says Term 1, Daily Life in Ancient Rome. I'm going to go through that in a moment because it's kind of got the same material as the booklet on Daily Life in Ancient Rome, but it's just here for your reference and learning as well. And also the Peloponnesian War. So Term 2, the Peloponnesian War, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to it. Assessment scope and requirements. Assessment at Stage 1, like all your other Stage 1 subjects, is entirely school-based, so nothing has to get sent off to Adelaide or anything like that. It's all done here in the school by me. I can be kind of slow getting your final results to you. I will try and be quick with that, but what I am fairly quick with is drafts. So I'm quite happy to do drafts for you. So if you've got your assignment completed and you want me to go over it and give you suggestions before you hand in the final, even if you're early on in the piece and you're not terribly sure if you're on the right track, if you want to give me a half-completed draft, I'm quite okay for that. Usually it's easiest to send that to my email, so on the front cover of this and of the other booklets, you've got my school email, gary.young898@schools.sa.edu.au. So just chuck me an email with your, preferably attached as a Word document. It's probably the easiest way for me to handle. I'm old and old-fashioned and not quite up with Google Documents and everything. I can handle it, I'll survive, but I like Word better, it's easier. So you do it either way, but I kind of prefer it that way. Down here we've got our assessment criteria. So there's KU 1, 2 and 3, RA1 and 2 and A1 and A2. And on the last page you've actually got the full rubric. So that tells you what all of those criteria are. On each of your assignments, I will identify which one of these assessments I'll be looking at, and that's the main difference between the assessment for Stage 1 and for Stage 2, because Stage 2 have got a separate rubric that's in their booklet, so that's different. So yeah, that's all fairly self-explanatory. I'll give you some time to read through that later. So basically, for Stage 1, your assessment has got Assessment Type 1, Skills and Applications, and Assessment Type 2, which is an inquiry. Skills and Applications is just basically the course assessment. So I'll be talking this term about daily life in ancient Rome, and so your assessments on that will be your Type 1 assessment. So we'll go through what those are for Term 1 in a little while when I get onto the other book. The other one is your inquiry. So you'll complete one inquiry in Stage 1 Ancient Studies. The focus of inquiry may be chosen by the teacher or negotiated by the student. The inquiry could be an extension of the material covered in class or a study of an aspect of a different ancient society or culture. So you can't do it on daily life in ancient Rome or the Peloponnesian War. They're basically the only things that are off limits. You need to pick another subject in ancient studies. So for the purpose of our study, ancient studies means anything in human history up to AD 907. So that's the fall of the Tang dynasty in China, if you're interested. So anything before 907 AD, you're allowed to study for your inquiry. So it can't be something that we've studied in class, it has to be something that you research separately. Now when you're doing an inquiry, you really need to set it up as a question rather, it's not an information report. You don't just tell me about something. What I want you to do is argue a case. So as it says here, the inquiry must enable students to investigate an aspect of an ancient study or culture, select appropriate sources and evidence by considering their authenticity, relevance, reliability, bias, audience and context. Particularly, I'll be looking for primary sources. Now, we'll talk about primary sources in a moment. Apply inquiry skills to analyse and synthesise evidence. So you'll be gathering evidence, picking it apart and then putting it together into a coherent piece. So analysis is basically pulling something apart, synthesis is putting something together. There's some good Greek prefixes for you. The ana is together, apart, and sun for synthesis means you're bringing it together. But anyway, this one's really important. Argue an informed and persuasive point of view about an idea, innovation, event, person or aspect of life from the selected society or culture. So you need to pick something, and it can be a wide range of things. You can pick a historical event. You can study a whole culture if you like, although that would be fairly broad. You can pick a historical character, so you can do a biography of that character. You can do Julius Caesar or Cleopatra or King Thutmose III from Egypt or someone like that, and do a biography of them. But again, you're not just telling me about that person, you need to argue a case. You need to say why they are significant, what they achieved, how important that was, something like that. So we can go into further detail about this later on in the course. So this won't be due till toward the end of Term 2, so you'll have the whole 2 terms to work on it. We will have dedicated time in class where you'll be working on your inquiries, because from bitter experience, I know if I don't do that, they just don't get done, and people just smash it out in the last 2 days of term, which doesn't work terribly well. So we will be having various checkpoints through the 2 terms just to make sure you're onto that. So what you need to do now is perhaps have a bit of a think, have a look at a few websites or something like that, and try and identify an area of interest, something that you might like to do your inquiry on. You need to communicate your findings in an appropriate form, taking into account the context, purpose and audience, and appropriately acknowledge sources. You can negotiate with me. The form of their inquiry can be multimodal, oral presentation, it can be written. Most people tend to prefer to produce an essay or something like that, but you don't have to. You can do it as a presentation, you can do it as a PowerPoint that you actually talk about. Still need references. but you don't have to reference as you go. Or equivalent in multimodal form, so surprise me. But we can talk a little bit again about those formats later on. And all of the assessment criteria are actually assessed with that inquiry. So that's 1,000 word inquiry. So you basically have a total of 5 assessments. 2 Term 1 assessments on daily life in ancient Rome, 2 Term 2 assessments on the Peloponnesian War, and a inquiry assessment that will be due at the end of Term 2. For Stage 2 students, you have a study that is due in kind of toward the end of Term 3, and that is 2,000 words. It's a similar sort of thing, but it's basically, same sort of thing. You're inquiring into something. It needs to be something where you argue, where you're using primary sources, and then having a look at some secondary sources as well. Yes, Archer?
Can I please have that laptop and charger? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Grab it. Cheers. Okay, so that brings us to this booklet, which is the daily life in ancient Rome. So that's what we're going to be studying in Term 1. So again, you've got my name and the email address there on the front cover. So again, please use that for drafts of your... And then 2 blank pages. Don't really know why. It's one of the wonders of the printer. Just suddenly decides to insert a blank page every now and again. So we'll examining, so I'm on this page here, examining aspects of daily life in early Imperial Rome from around about 31 BC to the end of the Antonine dynasty, which is in AD 192. Now I need to make sure that you're familiar with the dating system. So we have dates BC, and AD. Sometimes you'll see these as BCE and CE. So BCE is used instead of BC, CE is used instead of AD. So what's BC stand for?
Before Christ.
Before Christ. Okay, very good. BCE just stands for before the Common Era. So it's the same time, but it's just sort of like kind of a way of taking religion out of it. What about AD?
After death.
Okay. A lot of people say after death, but it's actually Anno Domini, which is Latin, and I'll be using lots of Latin and Greek terms because those are the languages that the Romans and the Greeks spoke, but it means in the year of the Lord. So it's a Latin term, and basically we are now in 2023 AD. Usually you say AD 2023, officially you're supposed to put the letters first. Or you can express that as 2023 CE, which means the Common Era. Again, the numbers are exactly the same. So you can use either, just be consistent. So if you're using BC, you use AD. If you're using BCE, you use CE. The trick with it is you have to remember that in BC the numbers go backwards. So it's kind of like... goes like that, because we're counting backwards from the birth of Christ. Actually, the early church got the birth of Christ wrong, and he was probably born somewhere around 6 to 4 BC. So they actually miscalculated it. We don't worry about that. We still count from the crossover between 1 BC and 1 AD there. And then we count backwards from 1 BC, so 100 BC, 200 BC. So 200 BC is older than 100 BC, so you just have to remember that. So we're studying basically from 31 BC up to AD 192. So that's kind of like the height of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire spanned a huge amount of territory. It went, if you're familiar with the geography of it, and we'll look a little bit more into this later on this week probably. Went all the way from Britain in the west all the way over to the modern country of Iraq in the east. Went from Germany in the north down to Egypt in the south, all across North Africa, all around the Mediterranean Sea. Roughly 1/5 of the population of the world at that time lived under the rule of the Roman emperors. They weren't kings, they were emperors, which to the Romans was an important distinction. And around about the same proportion at the time lived in the Chinese Empire. So there's actually about 2/5 of the human population of the world living basically in two different states. Those two empires were kind of like separated from one another by a lot of distance, but they were vaguely aware of one another's existence. But it was a hugely powerful and very significant state, and it's had a massive influence on basically the whole of civilization, in particular Western civilization, but it's pretty much affected the whole world. So a lot of what we do, the concepts that we have, come from Greek and Roman political thought, philosophy, and law. A lot of our law is based on Roman law. A lot of our politics is based on Greek political ideas, and particularly as they were developed through the Roman Empire. So a very, very significant state, and obviously extremely influential. Art, architecture, theatre, all of those things very heavily influenced by the Greeks first and then by the Romans afterwards. Even ideas of religion, even though the religions themselves have changed from Greek and Roman paganism, a lot of religious concepts come from them as well. So we're going to be studying that period because 31 BC is when the first Roman Emperor, Augustus, established himself as the ruler of the empire. Prior to him, Rome was a republic, which does not mean it was a democracy. It was far from a democracy. It meant it was dominated by basically about 600 leading men, the Senate of Rome, and they sort of like competed with one another for annually elected officers. So there were elements of democracy, but basically power was restricted pretty much to those 600 senators, or up to 600 senators. Sometimes it was less. You ended up with a whole series of civil wars between those leading men, and finally Augustus managed to defeat all of his rivals. He brought peace to the empire, but peace in the sense that all the other competitors were dead. So he beat them all in various civil wars. And he established a system which kind of looked like the old republic, but it basically meant that all power and all military control in particular was concentrated in his hands. And so that's what we call Imperial Rome from 31 BC, once the empire had been set up. The word imperial basically comes from the word empire, or from the Latin term imperator, which we generally translate as emperor. So I'll be using a lot of these Latin and Greek terms, and I'll be writing them up on the board. It's quite important for you to use those in your essays and assignments. So rather than just say the Roman, like the Roman family, you could use the Latin term, which is very similar, which is familia. And I'll actually list these, and we'll go through them as we go through the course materials. But it's good to include those in your essays and assignments because that's learning to use subject-specific language and specific terminology to the topic. So it's good to use that. It's good to make use of those kind of ideas. So again, lower down on this page, we're looking at some of the various aspects that we're looking at. So the nature and definition of Roman citizenship, the distinction between citizens and non-citizens, the role of the familia. So it's basically family, but familia had the idea of a household. So if you had slaves, which many Roman households would have done, that would be included in the familia. We wouldn't say it would be included in our idea of a family, but to the Romans, it was the slaves were a part of the familia, a part of the household. The roles and the responsibilities of the paterfamilias, so that's the father of the family, basically, as well as other members of the household. The sectors of society who are marginalised from positions of power, such as women, children, freed persons and slaves. A freed person is basically someone who was a slave who had been set free from slavery. that was actually quite common. If we think of slavery as it was, for example, in the American South in the 19th century, not very many slaves got freed. Under the Romans, quite a lot did. Some people, particularly educated people, would actually sell themselves into slavery, often to get out of debts, and basically bank on being set free eventually, at which point they became a Roman citizen. So it was actually a pathway to Roman citizenship. Some freed people actually became very, very powerful. So they were very high up in the imperial administration, the emperor's government of Rome. None of them ever became emperor, but a lot of them sort of made it a fair way up the ladder. There was one or a few, I think, sons of freed people who actually did become emperor. So, being an ex-slave, it had some social stigma to it, but it didn't stop you from climbing the social ladder. So we're looking at freed persons and slaves and the ways in which power was maintained and justified over them. So freed people were still kind of like marginalised to some extent. Women certainly were. Children and slaves, obviously, very much marginalised in their power. But we'll be looking at some interesting aspects of Roman society as well, because we tend to think of an empire like the Romans basically had these Romans in Italy and they're ruling over this huge territory, and that's the empire, and they're sort of like conquered and oppressed. It often started that way, but usually there was a pathway to citizenship. So, for example, Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, which we nowadays call France, and he'd completed that conquest by 48 BC. But within 50 years or so, or certainly by 100 years, Gauls were quite high up in the Roman administration. They were Roman citizens. They could join the Roman army, which meant you had to be a citizen, and that could be a pathway to power and influence as well. There were equestrians, which is sort of like the second highest rank in Roman society, and there were senators who were descended from Gauls. So people were incorporated in the empire, but then they could kind of become a part of the winning team. So they could become Roman, as it were. They could become Roman citizens, they could become part of the apparatus of empire. By the end of the empire, even by the time we're studying, by AD 192, a lot of emperors weren't actually born in Rome. And by the time you get up to the 300s, there were emperors who never even saw Rome, who came from the provinces, who gained power usually through the military and were acclaimed as emperor. So it wasn't sort of like just this central core of Romans ruling over everyone else. There were lots of pathways to social advancement and power, even if you lived in the provinces. And as I say, by the end of the empire, most of the emperors never actually even saw Rome. Rome became kind of unimportant. It was just like one big state. There were still, marginalised people in that state, but it didn't really matter that much where you actually came from. We'll be looking at aspects of Roman society such as daily life in different social classes. We're looking at education, looking at different occupations, the physical nature of the domus. Now the domus basically means a house or a home. So again, that's one of those terms that I want you to kind of like get used to using and use in your essays. And of the city in which it was located, the patron-client relationship and the public distribution of grain and other gifts. Now, some of this may not make any sense, maybe all of it doesn't make any sense, but we'll explain it slowly as we go through. Roman entertainment, that's always a popular one, and leisure activities, so we're looking at the baths, the circus. Circuses back in those days were not like circuses nowadays. Circuses kind of like nowadays have animals and clowns and things like that. To the Romans, the circus was basically where the chariot races took place. So you'd have these pretty violent chariot races, where 2-horse and 4-horse chariots charging around a hippodrome or a circus, which is sort of like kind of like an athletics track, except it was very long and the turns were quite tight at each end, so that it sort of like do laps like that, and all the crashes happened at the corners, and that's where the best seats were. People came along to see the crashes. But that was a hugely popular entertainment in the Roman world, and gladiators. We'll be looking at gladiatorial fights. So the gladiators were guys that basically, and sometimes women, who fought one another in the arena for the entertainment of others. They were slaves, as often were the chariot drivers, but they were also massive celebrities. So a lot of slaves, if you were kind of built and fairly good at fighting or something like that, you might think, yeah, I want to be a gladiator, and I'll be showing you a video later of that, pretty much that situation. And it was their path to freedom, for one thing, but also fame and fortune. A really successful gladiator could maybe fight 4 or 5 times in a year and would win huge amounts of prize money. And they were basically celebrities. They were sort of like fan clubs, basically, of people who were following their favourite gladiator, and they had huge crowds following them. So it's a very interesting kind of phenomenon. Tend to think the idea that one gladiator would get killed per fight. Usually that was not the case. Gladiators were very expensive to train, and a good way of upsetting a gladiatorial trainer was to kill off one of his gladiators. So if you fought well, you'd usually expect to live. It would only be in special circumstances that you might end up getting killed. So it's still not fun. It was definitely a risk for a gladiator, but it wasn't perhaps as bad as some people think it was. So we'll be looking at that in a fair degree of closeness. We'll have a critical evaluation of the usefulness of relevant primary sources. Now, can anyone tell me what a primary source is?
Books.
Books? What type of books specifically?
Encyclopedias.
No, it's more of a secondary one. Yeah.
Like sources that happen on the internet.
Yeah, sources from that time. So a book could be right if it was written at that time. So if it was written during the ancient period, but if it's a modern book about it, that's what we call a secondary source. So you'll be using both. A website, for example, where someone's writing about ancient Rome, that's a secondary source. Something that was actually written at that time, and there's quite a lot of stuff that was written from that time, and we'll talk a bit more about some primary sources later on. But if we're looking at, like there were historians, when we look at the Peloponnesian War in Term 2, a guy named Thucydides, an Athenian general and then writer, actually wrote an account of the whole war, which is our main primary source. There are others. In the Roman period, we've got the guy named Plutarch, who wrote biographies of people, so famous people, and he would write their life. Suetonius wrote biographies of the first 11 Roman emperors, as well as Julius Caesar, and a few other writings. There are historians from the Roman period, but there's also various documents from day-to-day life. The Romans liked setting up inscriptions, and we'll be using those quite a lot in our first study. And every week I'll be handing out a sheet with primary sources on it to help you to understand what we're talking about, and also to help write your essays and your other assignments. But they liked inscriptions. So nowadays, if someone dies, and we put a tombstone there, it'll usually just sort of have their name and their date of birth and death and maybe some of their relatives or something like that. The Romans would put basically their whole career, all their achievements. So if you were an army officer, for example, you'd put the unit that you commanded, you'd put where you served, any particular distinctions that you won, the rank that you achieved. So there's a lot more information. If you're a politician, you would put the offices that you held. And a huge portion of our inscriptions from the Roman world are actually tomb inscriptions, and they give us a lot of information about people. And it wasn't just like really famous gladiators and politicians and things like that. It could be average, everyday working people, sometimes even slaves. but the Romans wanted to be commemorated, they wanted to be remembered. And one of the ways they did that was to erect these inscriptions. And those inscriptions give us a massive amount of information about those people. So not just the really powerful, but particularly in our daily life unit, we'll be trying to get... Okay, I think I've started again. Okay, so there will be 2 video files apparently. Okay, so the schedule of classes, basically 1 lesson per week is probably going to be me talking about the major topic for discussion that week. Now, as well as the video version of it, which I'll be putting on the Google Classroom, there will also be written notes, which will basically be the notes that I teach from, that I'll put on DayMap and probably the Google Classroom as well. And I'll also have a sheet of primary sources. So the first lesson will be going through just the class material. The second lesson probably going through the primary sources. And the third lesson will just be time for you guys to work on your assignments. And so as we go through the term, there'll be probably less time with me talking and more time for you to do your assignments in that time. So each week I'll give you out a sheet that will have a selection of primary sources that are relevant to that week's material, and that will hopefully help you out with your understanding. I'll go through all of those. When you're referencing primary sources in your essays, you basically do it exactly as I have on the primary source sheet. So you can just copy and paste that into your essay. It counts to your word limit, so that's cool. But you just reference it exactly the same way that I've got it. So in ancient studies, primary sources are referenced differently. They're not referenced via the Harvard system or any other system. They've kind of got their own system. We basically use the Harvard system, which we'll talk about later, but you might already be familiar with it to some extent, for referencing in our for the secondary source. But the primary sources have got their own special way of referencing. So familiarity with the material covered in lectures and primary source discussions will be necessary for completing your assignment. So it is important. So as I say, there will be video versions of it, there will be me talking, there will be written versions of it in DayMap as well. So plenty of resources for you to use. Because I have a doctorate in this subject, you can use me as a secondary source. So you can reference G.K. Young, Ancient Studies Course Materials, Grant High School 2023, something like that, and you can actually use me. So don't use me as your only reference, but you can use me as a secondary reference because this is actually my area of qualification. So week 1, we'll be looking, hopefully we're getting into it by the end of the week, Roman citizenship, social class and status in Roman society. We're looking at the concept of citizenship, the legal and social distinctions between citizen and non-citizen, the definitions between social and political classes in Rome, the senatorial and equestrian orders, the decuriones in the provinces. So basically, the social makeup of Roman society is what we'll be talking about later on this week. So that might kind of overlap into week 2 a little bit, but then again we lose Monday's class in week 3 as well, so we'll see how we go. So this is just a guideline. It kind of can get a little bit rubbery, but I've got some breathing space in there. Second week we'll be looking at the familiar, the Roman household and its makeup, the roles and responsibilities of the paterfamilias, that's the father of the family, his relationships with the other members of the familia, overview of households of varying social classes, the household gods. So you, in Rome, you would have your own gods in your own household, as well as the sort of major gods like Jupiter and Mars and Venus and all of those that everybody worshipped. You would have the Lares and the Penates in your own house. You'd have a little cupboard usually with little statues of them, and that was basically the place where your household gods lived. So sort of like a mini state almost. Patron-client relationship and its significance to Roman society. Week 3 we'll be looking at women and children in Roman society. So the role of women in Roman society, types and rituals of marriage, different social classes, legal dependence and independence, marriage, sex and childbirth, the life of a Roman child, childhood mortality and its effect on Roman demographics. Some of the material gets a little bit MA15, but hopefully you guys will all be okay with that. If anybody does have any particular issue, we can sort of like, or your parents have an issue, we can work around that, but you know, it's all definitely to do with the subject, so hopefully it won't cause anyone any stress. Week 4, slaves and freedmen. The institution of slavery in ancient Rome, different types of slaves, domestic slavery, the process and legal effects of manumission. Manumission is basically when you set a slave free. The status of libertas liberta and its implications. That's a person who was a slave but has been set free. The roles and social status of freed persons, the class of infames and their legal status. Infames is just certain occupations such as prostitute, actor, ex-gladiator and a few like that. That was sort of like had legal penalties against them because, or legal difficulties they could have with the law just for being in that class. Week 5, education in Rome. Examination of the process of education in Rome, concentrating the differences that existed between rich and poor, between boys and girls. The role of education in the development of a sense of social status and gender identity is explored, as well as the way in which the virtus, the excellence, the virtue of the elite male was to be encouraged. Week 6, we'll look at leisure and entertainment. Such leisure and entertainment activities as the baths, the gladiatorial games, the circus, the theatre, the diversions of urban life. Social and political significance of these entertainments will be looked at, demonstrating these games and shows provide a place where the emperor and the aristocracy could directly contact the people. So they didn't have newspapers and news bulletins, they didn't have the internet obviously or anything like that. There were very few ways in which the emperor and the government could actually interact with the people, and the circus and the gladiatorial games was one of them. So that's where you could actually see the emperor. You wouldn't ordinarily see him. But it was a way of interaction, so it was important in that respect as well. Week 7, dinner parties, dining and the taberna. Taberna is basically the pub. That was an important part of Roman life. Has anyone heard of the city of Pompeii? There was a town in Italy that was covered over by the eruption of the volcano Vesuvius in AD 79, and it preserved the whole city virtually intact. And so there's houses and shops and hotels and pubs and everything that you'd expect in a city, basically preserved, buried by the volcano, and archaeologists have dug it up and found huge amounts of daily life in an ancient Roman city. And so a lot of the material that we'll be looking at actually comes from Pompeii. And you know, the stuff, there's official inscriptions, but there's also Pompeian graffiti. Believe it or not, back 2,000 years ago, people scribbled on walls and left graffiti around, and some of it is quite entertaining and interesting, and we can use that to learn about ancient Roman society as well. So the alternatives to these expensive parties that were favoured by the poorer members of society are also examined. Week 8, aspects of urban life in ancient Roman cities, so the physical structure of the ancient Roman city, city plans and streetscapes and so forth. Week 9, occupations, differing occupations of different social classes. Week 10, 11 will be dedicated to the completion of assignments. So for this term there are 2 assignments. So you've got assignment 1, a virtual museum, and assignment 2, a comparison task. So those are the 2 that you'll be expected to complete this term. So the first one is due, they're both due fairly late in the term because obviously I'm delivering the material as we go. And so it's sort of, if you choose something that I'm only going to discuss later in the course, that's not going to be very helpful for you handing in something in the first few weeks. So basically try and get a start on them as soon as you can, so there will be class time allocated for you to work on these assignments and to gather information about them. But students, for the first one, the virtual museum, in the second paragraph, I'll go back to the first paragraph too. So students will choose one of the areas studied in this course and prepare a virtual museum of annotated images. So basically it'll be a PowerPoint presentation or something like that, where you'll have images of something, an artefact usually from ancient Roman times, and you'll be annotating that. So that's how the virtual museum works. To display the evidence that we have to illustrate the aspect of ancient Roman life that they've chosen. So you can choose one of the weekly lesson topics, or you may concentrate on one particular aspect of one of the topics. For example, the role of the wife in the Roman family, or the gladiatorial games. You can choose any, just a smaller aspect of something that was studied in class. You'll choose approximately 10 images from your own research displaying information about their chosen subject. These images could be of buildings, wall paintings, mosaics, artefacts, statues, and any other relevant pieces of evidence from Imperial Rome, including excerpts from inscriptions and or literary texts. So for a slide, you don't actually necessarily have to have a picture of a thing. You could actually write out a text. So one of the primary sources that I've given you, for example, or some other primary sources that you've found. I've got books with lots of primary sources in them, so I can help you find additional ones if you want to and need to. So you can use literary texts as one of your slides in this. Each image should be explained and expanded upon by a series of annotations which could include literary and inscriptional quotes. These virtual museums may be presented as a PowerPoint, Prezi, as a video, a website, a poster or a series of posters, or any other suitable thing. So basically it's kind of like you're creating a museum display of 10 images that give us information about something. You're providing those annotations, that extra information along with that. Presenting it, as I say, in a website, a poster, a PowerPoint presentation. Most people usually choose a PowerPoint, but don't feel constrained to that. Word limit and due dates are as follows. Approximately 10, annotate by 1,000 words in total. Due end of week 9, draft presented by end of week 8. So it's a few weeks from the end. So hopefully, this will be the first one that you work on. Get that out of the way and then start work on your second essay. Oral presentation video should be no longer than 6 minutes and must include a bibliography sheet or slide. So you do need to include your references. You don't need to list primary sources in your reference list or bibliography, but you do need to reference any secondary sources that you've used, so any more modern books, encyclopedias and so forth. So drafts need to be presented by the end of week 8 if you want anything really useful. Earlier drafts may be handed in for feedback by negotiation. So if it's like week 6 and you don't want to use up your one draft, but you want to let me have a look at something to see how you're going, I'm perfectly happy for you to email me that. And I can have a look at that for you and get it back to you. So, although giving you your final marks, I have been known to take a couple of weeks to do that. If you send me a draft, you can usually expect that back in a couple of days. If a couple of days have gone by and hasn't got back to you, let me know, because there's a chance I've forgotten. It's possibly a good chance I've forgotten. So I'm usually with the drafts right onto them because I know you're working on it and I don't want you to lose your continuity and take a week to hand it back. So we'll get your drafts back quick to you. If it's been a couple of days and you haven't got it back, let me know, because as I say, there's a chance I've forgotten. You can negotiate a different assignment to study from those studied in the course. You need to have approval from me. All topics must consist of a study of an aspect of Roman society conducted by means of a study of ancient primary source artefacts and source materials. So the stage 1 assignments, so there's your KU1, RA1 and A1 for stage 1 and the same for stage 2. So those are in your relevant booklets. So stage 2 is in that booklet, stage 1 is in the other one. The second assignment is your comparison task. That's a 1,000-word essay which comprises one aspect of daily life in Imperial Rome with a similar comparable aspect in the modern world. Many areas of modern life are clearly influenced by the shadow of Rome, but in many ways these areas have undergone significant change. In the course of this essay, students are expected to highlight both the areas of influence on the modern world, but also areas of significant contrast. So you can choose any area covered in the course, or may concentrate on one particular aspect of an area, just like the other assignment. For example, students may compare and contrast Roman and modern entertainments, or alternatively, they might choose to contrast Roman gladiators with, for example, modern celebrities or rock stars. So you could just compare those aspects of society. One essay of maximum 1,000 words in total, or oral or multimedia equivalent, due end of week 11, draft presented by the end of week 10. So it's a little bit later, a couple of weeks later than your other one. Again, you can negotiate a different assignment topic from those studying the course, but you need to have my approval, blah, 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 blah. But they all must consist of a study of an aspect of Roman society and a comparison of that aspect with the corresponding aspect of modern society. Again, the stage 1 assignment design criteria are there for you, and the stage 2 one. So you're basically just choosing one aspect of what we're going to study and then contrasting it and comparing it with basically its equivalent from the modern world, or some aspect from the modern world. So you could compare the family, you could compare the status of women in Roman society compared to modern society. You could compare Roman citizenship to Australian citizenship, something like that. Lots of different comparisons. If you're not sure about it, just ask me. I'm happy to help you design a topic if you're not completely sure of where to go. You're probably not going to know exactly what you want to do right away. You might, but there's plenty of time to do that. Okay, so that's basically what I wanted to cover in this lesson, just to get those books introduced to you. So hopefully now we've just got some time where I'll get you to just read through those books, because I kind of skipped through a fair bit of it then, and you can ask any questions that you need answered. And I'm going to turn off the video now.